The golden leaves danced through the crisp afternoon air, creating a melancholy symphony that echoed across the deserted town square. Edward Myers adjusted his grey coat and sighed deeply, watching the scarce movement on Main Street. At 47, he carried on his shoulders the weight of a life built with mathematical precision, yet devoid of the human warmth he had so despised in his ambitious youth. Sitting on the steps of the public library, he distractedly flipped through the pages of a newspaper he had already read 3 times. The headlines seemed distant, irrelevant, in the face of the emptiness that had settled in his chest since the divorce was finalized 2 months ago. Mary Ann had taken with her not only the furniture from the house, but also the last vestiges of hope he had held, of winning back the family he had destroyed with his obsession for work. The renowned author, writer of 15 children's books published in 17 countries, had never imagined he would one day be here alone, like an emotional beggar, unable to fill the deafening silence of his own existence. His works spoke of united families, magical adventures between parents and children, values like love and understanding. A cruel irony of fate. He knew how to write about family, but he had never known how to build one. The smell of cold coffee in his paper cup mingled with the scent of dry leaves accumulating in the corners of the staircase. Edward closed his eyes, trying to push away the memories that insisted on haunting him. The voice of Peter, his 25-year-old son, echoed in his mind like a sentence. "Dad, you were never there. Now that I need you, it's too late." 2 weeks. It had only been 2 weeks since Peter had left for Germany, accepting a job offer that would definitively separate him from the United States. The young man had said he needed distance. That geographical proximity to his father only intensified the pain of a childhood marked by emotional absence. Edward had bitten his tongue, swallowing the words of apology that had never sounded convincing. A soft noise interrupted his thoughts. Small, hesitant steps approached on the uneven sidewalk. Edward looked up and saw a tiny figure walking in his direction. A girl of about 6, wearing shabby but relatively clean clothes, was clutching something to her chest as if it were a priceless treasure. She stopped a few feet away, studying him with large, expressive eyes that seemed to carry a precocious wisdom, typical of those who mature too soon. Her brown hair was unkempt, and small smudges of dirt marked her rosy cheeks. Yet, there was a genuine sweetness in her expression that touched something dormant in Edward's hardened heart. "Excuse me, mister?" she murmured, approaching timidly. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, filled with a politeness that contrasted with her forlorn appearance. Could you read to me?" Edward blinked, surprised by the unexpected approach. There was something in the child's posture that intrigued him deeply. She held a book against her chest, and her small fingers trembled slightly, whether from the afternoon chill or the nervousness of her approach. "I don't know how to read," she continued, looking down. "And this book, it looks really beautiful. It has a daddy bear and a baby bear on the cover." Edward's heart stopped for a moment. Slowly, he focused on the object the girl was holding. Even from a distance, he immediately recognized the familiar illustration. It couldn't be. Fate wouldn't be so cruel as to— "May I see the book?" he asked, extending his hand carefully so as not to startle her. The girl hesitated for a moment, then delicately placed the worn copy in his hands. Edward felt the world spin around him. There it was, faded by time and use. His own book, The Adventures of Theodore the Bear and His Cub. His hands trembled. Edward held the book with an almost religious reverence, his fingers gently tracing the worn-out cover. The once vibrant illustration now showed signs of heavy use, the faded colors telling the silent story of how many small hands had touched those pages. Theodore the Bear, a character he had created inspired by the relationship he had dreamed of having with Peter, gazed back at him with his kind, painted eyes. "Where did you find this book?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady as the child settled beside him on the cold step. "In the donation box at the church over there," she replied, pointing to the building across the square. "There were a lot of books, but this was the only one that caught my eye." "Do you know why?" Edward shook his head, though he sensed the answer would tear him apart inside. "Because I've never had a daddy," she said with devastating simplicity. "And I wanted to know what it's like when a dad and his son are together. On the cover, they look happy." The girl's words hit Edward like a series of well-aimed punches. He closed his eyes for a moment, fighting against the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. When he opened them again, he found the child's expectant gaze fixed on his face. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Sophia," she replied, smiling for the first time. "And yours?" "Edward." He hesitated for a moment, then made a decision that would change both of their lives. "Sophia, I have to tell you something about this book. I'm the one who wrote this story." Sophia's eyes widened in genuine amazement. She looked back and forth between Edward and the book, as if trying to process the impossible information. "You wrote it," she whispered, holding the book even more carefully. "Really?" "Really," Edward confirmed, feeling tears burn his eyes. "I wrote it many years ago, thinking about my own son." "You have a son?" The question was filled with a childish hope that broke Edward's heart. "I do, but he grew up far from me. I worked too much and didn't know how to be the father he needed." The words came out more easily than Edward expected, as if Sophia's innocence created a safe space for his most painful confessions. Sophia nodded gravely, with a maturity she shouldn't have possessed at her age. "So you know how sad it is when daddies and their kids are far apart," she said, gently touching Edward's hand. "I always imagined what it would be like to have a dad who read me stories." Edward felt a lump in his throat. Here was a child who had never had the opportunity he had squandered, a girl who valued the very thing he had neglected with Peter. "Would you like me to read it to you?" he offered, carefully opening the book to the first page. The smile that lit up Sophia's face was more radiant than any literary award Edward had ever received. She snuggled up beside him, and he began to read, his voice thick with emotion. "Once upon a time, in a magical forest, there lived a bear named Theodore and his beloved cub." As he read, Edward realized how each word gained new meaning in Sophia's presence. She asked questions, laughed at the right moments, and her eyes shone with a pure admiration he had never seen on Peter's face as a child. The afternoon wore on, and other passers-by paid no attention to the famous author reading to a street girl. For Edward, that moment was more real and meaningful than any book signing or interview he had ever given. When he finished the story, Sophia remained silent for a few minutes, absorbing every detail. "It's the most beautiful story I've ever heard," she finally murmured. "Theodore the bear is a very good daddy. He's the dad I wish I'd been," Edward confessed, surprising himself with his own honesty. Sophia looked at him with a wisdom that transcended her age. "Maybe you still can be," she said simply. In that moment, Edward understood that his meeting with Sophia was no coincidence. Fate had placed in his hands the chance for redemption he so desperately sought. Disguised as an abandoned child who carried her own dreams in a worn-out book, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange that reflected off the library windows. Edward realized he had lost all track of time during the reading, completely absorbed by Sophia's presence. The girl remained nestled beside him, delicately flipping through the book's pages as if each illustration were a precious treasure. "Sophia," he said softly, "it's getting late. Where do you live? Your parents must be worried." The smile on the girl's face gradually faded, replaced by a melancholy expression that Edward recognized as being similar to his own. She lowered her gaze, her small fingers nervously playing with the edge of the book. "I don't have a home," she murmured, so quietly that Edward had to lean in to hear. "And I don't have parents either." Edward's heart constricted. He had assumed Sophia was just a lost child, perhaps momentarily separated from her guardians. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, you don't have a home?" he asked gently, trying to keep his tone calm so as not to frighten her. Sophia looked up, and Edward saw in her eyes a profound sadness that no child should ever carry. "My parents left when I was very little. First my mommy, then my daddy. The neighbor looked after me for a while, but she said she couldn't anymore." The words came out in a continuous stream, as if she were relieved to finally have someone to listen to her story. "Now I sleep in different places, sometimes in the square, sometimes behind the bakery when the baker lets me." Edward felt his throat tighten with each revelation. A 6-year-old child, alone on the streets, surviving on the occasional generosity of strangers. The situation was far more serious than he had imagined. "And do you eat? How do you get food?" he asked, dreading the answer. "The lady at the diner on the corner sometimes gives me leftovers," Sophia explained, pointing to a small establishment across the street. "And there's a woman who sells bread at the farmer's market who always saves one for me. People aren't all bad." The girl's resilience impressed Edward. Even in her desperate situation, she could see kindness in the world. It was a life lesson that he, with all his experience and education, had never learned. "Sophia, have you ever been to school?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. She shook her head. "Never. That's why I can't read. But I love looking at the books and imagining the stories from the pictures." Her eyes lit up again. "That's why it was so special when you read to me. It was like the pictures came to life." Edward felt a determination growing in his chest. He couldn't just walk away and let Sophia return to the streets, but he also didn't know how to proceed. His life had always been governed by planning and control, and now he was faced with a situation that required decisions from the heart. "Listen, Sophia," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's too cold for you to sleep on the street tonight. How about I take you to a hotel? You could have a warm bath, a decent meal, and sleep in a real bed." Sophia looked at him with a mixture of hope and suspicion. It was clear she had been disappointed by adults before. "You'd do that for me?" she asked hesitantly. "But why? You don't even know me." Edward paused to reflect on the question. Why did he care so much about an unknown child? The answer came naturally from the depths of his wounded soul. "Because you reminded me of something very important that I had forgotten," he said honestly. "You reminded me how precious the time we spend with the people we love is, and maybe you can teach me how to be a better person." Sophia considered his words for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she stood up and extended her small hand to Edward. "Okay," she said with a shy smile, "but do you promise you won't leave me later?" The question hit Edward squarely. It was exactly what Peter might have asked years ago, when he was still a child yearning for his father's attention. This time, Edward was determined not to repeat the same mistakes. "I promise," he said solemnly, squeezing Sophia's small hand. "I won't leave you." As they walked down the street, Edward couldn't stop thinking about the irony of the situation. He, who had failed as a father, now found himself responsible for a child who desperately needed care and protection. Was this his chance for redemption, or just another path to disappointment? The lobby of the modest but clean hotel echoed with the footsteps of Edward and Sophia. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses hanging around her neck, looked up and frowned slightly at the unusual pair. Edward noticed the questioning gaze and felt compelled to explain. "I'd like a room for myself and my niece," he said, hesitating for only a moment. She'll be staying with me for a few days." Sophia looked at him with curiosity, but said nothing. The girl's precocious intelligence made her intuitively understand that some situations required small adaptations of the truth. After the check-in process, Edward led Sophia down the corridor to the room. It was simple but cozy, with 2 single beds and a view of the square where they had met. Sophia stood at the doorway for a moment, as if she couldn't believe she was really allowed to enter. "You can come in," Edward encouraged gently. "This is your room too." Sophia took small, cautious steps, her wide eyes taking in every detail. She gently touched the fabric of the curtains, tested the softness of the bed with her palm, and was fascinated by the private bathroom. "It has a real bathtub," she whispered in wonder. "I've never taken a bath in a bathtub." Edward felt his heart ache again. How many simple experiences, which he took for granted, were extraordinary novelties for Sophia. "How about you take a nice warm bath while I order some food?" he suggested. "Then we can have dinner and talk more." While Sophia explored the bathroom with the joy of a child discovering an amusement park, Edward called room service and ordered a simple but nutritious meal. He also called a nearby children's clothing store, explaining the situation and asking them to deliver some basic items to the hotel. When Sophia came out of the bath, wearing the fluffy hotel robe that was huge on her small body, her clean hair revealed golden highlights that time on the streets had hidden. She looked like a completely different child, and Edward realized how the dignity of being clean and safe transformed her entire posture. "I'm very hungry," she admitted, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I haven't eaten anything since yesterday morning." The confession hit Edward like a slap in the face. While he was worrying about literary reviews and publishing contracts, Sophia was going days without eating. The perspective was devastatingly clarifying. Dinner arrived along with the clothes. Edward watched Sophia eat with a restrained veracity, trying to maintain good manners even while starving. She said thank you with every bite, a politeness she had likely learned from the neighbor who had looked after her. "Sophia," Edward said after she had finished eating, "can you tell me more about your parents? What happened to them?" Sophia was quiet for a long moment, fiddling with her napkin. "Mummy got really sad after I was born," she began slowly. "The neighbor said she had a sickness in her head that made her cry a lot. One day she left and never came back." She paused, swallowing hard. "Daddy tried to take care of me by himself, but he drank things that made him angry. After a while, he left too." Edward felt tears burn his eyes. Sophia's story was one of double abandonment, of parents who couldn't overcome their own internal struggles to care for their daughter. It was different from his situation with Peter, but the end result was the same, a child wounded by parental absence. "Are you angry at them?" he asked softly. Sophia considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but the neighbor said that sometimes grown-ups are too broken inside to even take care of themselves. She said they loved me, but they didn't know how to show it." The girl's wisdom constantly impressed Edward. At 6 years old, she already possessed an understanding of forgiveness and compassion that he had taken decades to develop. "What about you? Do you have kids?" Sophia asked, turning the question on him. Edward hesitated. How could he explain to an abandoned child that he had chosen to distance himself from his own son? "I have a son named Peter," he finally said. "He's a grown-up now, but when he was little, I worked too much and didn't spend enough time with him. Now he lives far away and is angry with me." Sophia nodded understandingly. "Maybe he's just sad, like I get sometimes. When people are very sad, sometimes they get angry too." Edward looked at Sophia with growing admiration. How could a child who had suffered so much have such a capacity to understand and forgive? "Sophia, what do you want most in the world?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. "A real family, someone who reads me stories every day and who will never leave." She looked directly into Edward's eyes. "What about you?" Edward swallowed hard, realizing the answer was simpler than he had imagined. "The same thing," he whispered. "Exactly the same thing." The next morning brought a golden light that filtered through the room's curtains, creating dancing patterns on the floor. Edward woke up early, as was his habit, but this time it wasn't the weight of loneliness that roused him. Beside him, in the neighboring bed, Sophia slept soundly, her relaxed features displaying the peace a safe night had provided. Edward watched her for a few minutes, noticing how she held the book firmly against her chest. Even in her sleep, the image touched something deep in his heart, a paternal tenderness that had been dormant for years. When Sophia woke up, her eyes widened for a moment, as if she had forgotten where she was. Then her face lit up with a radiant smile when she saw Edward. "Good morning, Mr. Ed," she said, stretching like a kitten. "I slept in a real bed. It was the best sleep of my life." "Good morning, Princess," Edward replied, surprised at the naturalness of the affection. "How about we have some breakfast and then think about what to do today?" During breakfast at the hotel restaurant, Edward watched Sophia try foods that were clearly new to her. Fresh pastries, assorted fruits, real juice. Each bite was met with a gratitude that made Edward question how many simple things he had taken for granted throughout his life. "Mr. Eddie," Sophia said while trying strawberry jam for the first time, "are you going to teach me to read?" "Of course I am," he replied without hesitation. "In fact, I was thinking of taking you to buy some books today, your very own books, so we can start your lessons." Sophia's eyes shone with a pure joy that Edward had never seen in any child. After breakfast, they walked to a bookstore in the center of town. Sophia held Edward's hand tightly, marveling at the shop windows and the bustle of people. For her, who had spent months watching life from a distance, actively participating in the world was a magical experience. In the bookstore, Sophia was ecstatic with the sheer number of books. She ran through the aisles, gently touching the colorful covers as if she were in a sacred museum. Edward selected a few learn-to-read books and several other age-appropriate children's stories. "Are all of these for me?" Sophia asked, incredulous, as Edward approached the cashier with a stack of books. "All yours," he confirmed, smiling at the girl's reaction. It was as they were leaving the bookstore that Edward received the first shock of reality. Mary Ann, his ex-wife, was standing on the opposite sidewalk, watching him with an expression that mixed surprise with something he couldn't quite identify. "Daddy!" Sophia shouted instinctively, waving at Mary Ann before Edward could stop her. Mary Ann crossed the street with determined steps, her expression hardening with each stride. She wore a stylish outfit that Edward recognized as one of her favorites, and her dark hair was perfectly coiffed. She looked like a colder version of the woman he had once loved. "Edward," she said as she approached, "I need to talk to you. Now." Sophia sensed the tension in the air and hid shyly behind Edward, holding his hand tighter. "Mary Ann, this is Sophia," Edward said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Sophia, this is a friend of mine." "I am not your friend," Mary Ann cut in, her gaze alternating between Edward and Sophia. "And I want an explanation. I got a call from the hotel saying you were staying there with a child. What on earth is going on?" Edward's blood ran cold. He hadn't thought the hotel might contact Mary Ann, who was still listed as his emergency contact. "It's complicated," he began. "Sophia needed help and—" "Did you kidnap a child?" Mary Ann interrupted, raising her voice. "Edward, have you completely lost your mind?" Sophia began to tremble behind Edward. He felt her small hand grip his tightly and realized how frightening the situation must be for her. "It's nothing like that," he said firmly. "Sophia was alone on the streets. I'm just trying to help her." Mary Ann laughed bitterly. "Help? You, who could never even help your own son?" "Edward, You're having a pathetic midlife crisis. This isn't helping a child. It's using a vulnerable situation to feed your own guilt. Marianne's words hit Edward like a series of well-aimed punches. Each accusation resonated with his own insecurities. "You don't understand," he murmured. "I understand perfectly," she retorted. "You want to play dad because you failed so miserably with Peter. But this isn't a game, Edward. This child needs professional care, not your redemption fantasies." Sophia stepped out from behind Edward and looked directly at Marianne. "You're being mean to Mr. Ed," she said with a courage that surprised both adults. "He's good to me. He read me stories and gave me food." Marianne looked at Sophia for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "Sweetheart, you don't understand. This man can't take care of you properly." "Why not?" Sophia asked innocently. "He's taking very good care of me." Edward saw an internal struggle in Marianne's eyes, as if she were trying to decide between genuine concern and accumulated resentment. "Because," she finally said, "he has a history of abandoning the people he loves." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward felt each word like a sentence, knowing that Marianne wasn't wrong. But when he looked at Sophia, he saw in the girl's eyes an unshakable trust that strengthened him. "This time will be different," he said with conviction. Marianne crossed her arms, her rigid posture reflecting years of accumulated hurts. The street life continued normally around them, but for Edward, the world had shrunk to that small circle of tension where his past and present violently collided. "This time will be different," she repeated with sarcasm. "You said the exact same thing when Peter was born. You promised you'd be a present father, that you'd balance work and family. Remember?" Edward looked down, painful memories flooding his mind. Marianne was right. He had made similar promises before and had broken them one by one, always prioritizing deadlines and professional commitments over family moments. Sophia watched the tense exchange between the adults, her hand still firmly entwined with Edward's. Even without fully understanding the situation, she sensed that something important was being discussed about her future. "Mr. Ed," she whispered, gently tugging his sleeve, "is she mad because you didn't take good care of your son?" Sophia's innocent question landed like a bomb in the middle of the argument. Marianne looked at the girl in surprise, while Edward felt his face burn with shame. How could a 6-year-old so quickly grasp the heart of the problem? "Yes, sweetheart," Marianne replied softly, crouching down to be at Sophia's level. "I'm worried because he hurt a family very badly in the past." Sophia considered the words for a moment, then looked at Edward with a seriousness that touched his heart. "But everyone deserves a second chance, right?" she said. "The neighbor who looked after me always said that. She said people can learn to be better." Edward felt tears burn his eyes. Here was a child who had been abandoned by her own parents, defending his capacity for change to a woman he had hurt deeply. Marianne remained crouched, studying Sophia's face. Edward could see an internal battle in her eyes, the part of her that still cared for him, fighting against years of resentment. "Edward," she said finally, standing up, "that you can't just decide to be a father to a random child because you feel guilty about Peter." "She's not random," Edward replied, with more firmness than he expected. "Sophia, she showed me things about myself that I had forgotten. She reminded me why I started writing children's books." "And what happens when the inspiration fades?" Marianne asked cruelly. "When you get tired of playing dad and want to go back to your organized, lonely life? What happens to Sophia then?" The question hit Edward squarely because he recognized the validity of the concern. His tendency toward isolation and work obsession were deeply ingrained traits. Was he truly capable of genuine change? "I won't abandon her," he said, more to himself than to Marianne. "You abandoned Peter," she replied without mercy. You abandoned me. You abandoned everyone who tried to get close to you when work became more important. Sophia, who had remained quiet during the exchange, suddenly let go of Edward's hand and walked over to Marianne. Were you abandoned too? She asked with a compassion that disarmed the adult woman's defenses. Marianne blinked, clearly not expecting the direct question. She hesitated, then sighed. Yes, sweetheart, I was. Then you know how much it hurts, Sophia said simply. I know how much it hurts too. But Mr. Ed is different from my parents. He stays with me and reads me stories. He's not going to leave. Edward watched his ex-wife struggle with the emotions that Sophia's childlike perspective was awakening. He knew that, deep down, Marianne had always wanted children, but their attempts to conceive during their marriage had failed, creating an additional layer of pain in their relationship. Sophia, Marianne said gently, you are a very special little girl. But taking care of a child is much more complicated than reading stories and buying books. I know, Sophia replied with surprising maturity. I know I'll be a lot of work, but I promise to be good. I promise to learn to read fast and help with everything I can. Edward saw tears form in Marianne's eyes. He recognized that expression. It was the same one she had when they talked about having children, a mixture of hope and fear. Edward, she said finally, if you're serious about this, you need to do things the right way. Sophia needs documents, school, medical care. She needs legal stability. I know, he agreed. I've already thought about that. I'm going to find a lawyer who specializes in adoption. Adoption? Marianne's eyes widened. Are you serious? Completely serious, Edward replied, surprised by the clarity of his own determination. Sophia looked between the two adults, her face lighting up with cautious hope. Does that mean I can stay, that I can have a real family? Edward knelt beside Sophia, taking her small hands in his. It means I'm going to do everything in my power to make that happen, he promised solemnly. Marianne watched the scene for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Edward's surprise, she said something that would change everything. If you're really determined to do this, you shouldn't do it alone. A child needs a complete family. Edward looked at her, not fully understanding what she was suggesting. What do you mean? He asked. Marianne took a deep breath, as if making a decision that frightened her. Maybe we could try again. For Sophia, for us, for everything we lost. Edward's world stopped. Edward felt the world spin around him. Marianne's words echoed in his mind like a distant, almost unreal sound. Sophia looked between the two adults with an expression of growing hope, not fully understanding the magnitude of what was being discussed. Are you serious? Edward finally managed to articulate. Marianne nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on Sophia's face. I've spent the last 2 months alone, Edward, questioning everything that happened between us, trying to understand where we went wrong. She paused, swallowing hard. Maybe I was too hard on you. Maybe we both made mistakes. Sophia, sensing something important was happening, took both adults' hands. Are you going to be my family? She asked in a small voice, filled with a hope so pure it broke Edward's heart. Before anyone could answer, Edward's cell phone rang. The name on the screen made him freeze. Peter. Answer it, Marianne said softly. He needs to know what's happening. With trembling hands, Edward answered the call. My dad. Peter's voice sounded distant and tense. I got a weird call from Mom. She said you're with some kid. What the hell is going on over there? Edward looked at Sophia, who was watching him with big, curious eyes. Peter, it's a long story. I met a little girl who needed help, and you met a little girl. Peter's voice was filled with disbelief and something else. Pain. Are you kidding me, Dad? You, who never had time to be my father, are now playing dad with a stranger. The words hit Edward like punches. Sophia frowned, clearly sensing that the conversation was causing distress. "Peter, it's not like that. No!" Peter's voice exploded through the phone. "You don't have the right to do this. You don't get to be a father to someone else when you were never one for me." Edward felt tears burn his eyes. On the other end of the line, he could hear Peter's heavy breathing, filled with years of repressed hurt. "Son, please, let me explain." "I'm not your son anymore," Peter shouted. "You lost that right a long time ago, and now I find out you're trying to replace our broken family with some fantasy with a random kid." Sophia, who had been listening to the one-sided conversation, gently touched Edward's arm. "Mr. Ed," she whispered, "is your son sad?" Edward nodded, unable to speak through the lump in his throat. "Peter," he tried again, "I know I made terrible mistakes with you. I know I was an absent father and that I hurt you deeply. But this little girl, she's shown me things about myself that I need to change." "Change?" Peter laughed bitterly. "Dad, you're 47 years old. People like you don't change. You'll get tired of this perfect family game and go back to your lonely life, just like you always do." Sophia frowned and, to everyone's surprise, held out her hand for the phone. "Can I talk to him?" she whispered. Edward hesitated, but something in Sophia's determined expression convinced him to hand over the device. "Hello?" Sophia said in her sweet voice. "Are you Peter?" There was a silence on the other end of the line. Who is this?" Peter's voice sounded confused. "I'm Sophia. Your daddy found me when I was very sad and lonely." She spoke with the direct simplicity of a child. "He read me stories and gave me food. He's very good to me." "Listen, kid," Peter's voice was tense. "You don't understand. This man isn't reliable. He'll let you down." "Why are you mad at your daddy?" Sophia asked innocently. Edward could hear Peter breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Because he was never there when I needed him. He chose work over me, always." Sophia considered this for a moment. "That must have hurt a lot," she said finally. "I know what it's like when daddies leave. Mine left too." The line went silent for a long moment. "Your parents, they abandoned you?" Peter asked, his voice softening slightly. "Yes, but Mr. Ed promised me he won't leave, and I believe him." "How can you believe him?" Peter asked, and Edward could hear the vulnerability in his voice. How can you trust someone who's already broken so many promises?" Sophia looked directly into Edward's eyes as she answered, "Because sometimes people get lost, but that doesn't mean they're bad. He reads to me with a really kind voice, like I'm very special, and when he looks at me I can see he's trying to be better." Edward felt tears stream freely down his face. Mary Ann's eyes were also glistening. "Sophia," Peter said, his voice breaking, "you sound like a very special girl, but I need to protect you from getting hurt. My father, he's not good at keeping promises. So why don't you come home and help him learn?" Sophia asked with the simple logic of childhood. "If you're both here, he can't leave us." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward held his breath, waiting for the response from Peter that could change everything. Peter hesitated. "I'm coming back. But it's not for a happy reunion. It's to make sure you're safe and to confront my father about this madness." Sophia beamed. "You're going to meet your new little sister," she exclaimed, handing the phone back to Edward. The line had gone dead. Peter was coming home, not for a reconciliation, but for a final battle that would decide the fate of them all. The next 3 days passed in a blur of intense emotions and frantic preparations. Edward knew that Peter's arrival would be a decisive moment, and he felt the weight of that responsibility grow with each passing hour. Sophia, oblivious to the tension her presence had created, maintained an infectious optimism about meeting her big brother. Edward and Mary Ann had decided to face the situation together, at least until Peter arrived. They gathered in the apartment that had once been their home, a space still marked by the ghosts of a marriage that hadn't survived the pressures of adult life. "He was always so stubborn," Marianne said, as she watched Sophia cautiously explore the house. "Even as a child, once he made up his mind, it was almost impossible to get him to change it." Edward nodded. Remembering the heated arguments he'd had with Peter during his teenage years. Arguments that almost always ended with his son shutting himself in his room and Edward diving into work to avoid the conflict. Sophia had become enchanted with Edward's personal library. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books with reverence, occasionally pulling one out to admire the cover. It was fascinating to see how she treated each book like a treasure, a stark contrast to Peter, who had grown up surrounded by books but had rarely shown a genuine interest in literature. "Mr. Ed," Sophia called out, holding an old copy of a fairy tale book, "did you write all of these?" "Not all of them," Edward laughed. "But some of them. Yes, these ones," he said, pointing to a specific shelf, "are the ones Daddy wrote." Sophia picked up each of Edward's books, examining them closely. There were 15 titles, each representing years of dedicated work, sleepless nights, and sacrificed weekends. It was ironic that a child who couldn't read showed more interest in his work than his own son ever had. "Why did you stop writing?" Marianne asked, noticing that the most recent book was dated 2 years ago. Edward hesitated. The truth was, after the divorce and Peter's estrangement, he had lost his inspiration. How could he write about happy families when his own had disintegrated? How could he create stories about loving fathers when he himself had failed in that role? "I lost my way," he admitted finally. "I couldn't write about things I no longer believed in." Sophia, who had been listening to the conversation, approached with one of his books in her hands. "But you believe now, don't you?" she asked with that disarming wisdom she possessed. "That's why you're taking care of me." Edward's heart tightened. Sophia was right. In the last few days, something had reignited within him, a spark of hope he thought he had lost forever. Marianne watched the interaction with a complex expression. Edward could see in her a struggle between the skepticism built up over the years and a genuine desire to believe that people could change. "Edward," she said softly, "if we're going to try to make this work, we need to be honest with each other. About everything. About our fears, our expectations, our limits." He nodded, acknowledging the wisdom of her request. "I'm scared," he confessed. "Scared of repeating the same mistakes. Scared of disappointing Sophia the same way I disappointed Peter and you." "And I'm scared that this is just a phase," Marianne admitted. "A reaction to a midlife crisis that will pass when the reality of raising a child becomes routine and tiresome." Sophia, who had been listening intently, placed herself between the two adults. Are you scared of me?" she asked with genuine concern. "No, sweetheart." Edward knelt to be at her level. "We're not scared of you. We're scared of not being good enough for you. But you just have to try," Sophia said simply. "The neighbor who looked after me always said that the important thing isn't to be perfect, it's to really care." At that moment, the intercom buzzed. The doorman announced that a young man was asking for Edward. Peter had arrived. Edward felt his stomach clench. He looked at Marianne, who was pale, and then at Sophia, who seemed excited at the prospect of meeting Peter. "He's here," Edward murmured. Sophia ran to the window, trying to see who was arriving. "Is he tall like you?" she asked excitedly. "Does he like books too?" Edward and Marianne exchanged a look heavy with apprehension. They knew the next few minutes would determine the future of everyone in the room. "Sophia," Edward said gently, "Peter is very angry with me. He might say things that will confuse or scare you, but I want you to know that no matter what happens, I won't give up on you." Sophia looked at him with unshakable confidence. "I know," she said simply. And maybe after he gets to know you properly, he'll stop being angry. The sound of the elevator echoed down the hall. Heavy footsteps approached the door. Edward took a deep breath and went to open it. Peter stood there, taller and leaner than Edward remembered, his dark eyes filled with a determination that foretold a confrontation. There was a rigidity in his posture that Edward recognized. It was the same one he himself adopted when preparing for a difficult battle. "Dad!" Peter said coldly. "Peter," Edward replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Thank you for coming." "I'm not here for you," Peter said, walking into the apartment uninvited. "I'm here for her." His eyes found Sophia, who was watching him with open curiosity, unafraid. For a moment, Peter's hard expression faltered slightly. The storm was about to begin. The silence that followed Peter's entrance was as thick as a thundercloud. Sophia, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air, approached him with a child's natural curiosity. "Are you Peter?" she asked, tilting her head to get a better look at him. "You're so tall, and you have the same eyes as Mr. Ed." Peter looked at Sophia for a long moment, his expression involuntarily softening in the face of the girl's innocence. Then, as if remembering why he was there, his face hardened again. "Yes, I'm Peter," he said curtly. "And you must be the famous Sophia I've heard about." Sophia beamed. "Famous? No one's ever called me famous before." She took Peter's hand naturally. "Do you want to see the books Mr. Ed gave me? He's teaching me to read." Peter gently withdrew his hand. "Maybe later, Sophia. First, I need to talk to Edward. Can you go play in your room for a few minutes?" "Actually," Mary Ann interrupted, "why don't we all sit down and talk like civilized people? Sophia is part of this family now. She has a right to understand what's happening." Peter laughed bitterly. "Family? Mom, you've been together with this kid for less than a week, and you're already talking about family." Edward felt his temper rise, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Peter, I know you're hurt. I know I owe you a huge debt for everything I did wrong, but Sophia is not to blame for my past mistakes." "No," Peter turned to face his father. "She's literally the symbol of your mistakes. You're trying to redeem yourself by using a vulnerable child as a personal therapy project." Sophia frowned, sensing she was being discussed in a way she didn't fully understand. "Why are you mad at Mr. Ed?" she asked Peter. "He's not hurting anyone." Peter knelt to be at Sophia's level, his voice softening. "Sophia, you seem like a very sweet girl, but this man has a history of making promises he can't keep. He will disappoint you, just like he disappointed me." "He won't," Sophia said with absolute conviction. "He promised me he wouldn't leave, and I believe him." "I believed him once too," Peter murmured, and Edward felt each word like a blade. "I believed him when he promised to come to my soccer game. I believed him when he said we'd go fishing that weekend. I believed him when he promised to teach me how to drive." Edward closed his eyes, every memory of a broken promise returning with devastating force. "Peter," he began. "No!" Peter stood up abruptly. "You don't have the right to try and explain yourself now. Where were these explanations when I was 10 years old and crying because my father chose a publishers' meeting over my birthday?" Sophia looked at Edward with concern. "Did you make Peter cry when he was little?" she asked. The simple, direct question hit Edward harder than all of Peter's accusations. He nodded slowly. "Yes, Sophia. I did a lot of wrong things when Peter was a child. I wasn't the father he deserved. But you're different now," Sophia said with the unwavering confidence of childhood. "You read to me, you play with me, you make me feel special." Peter watched the interaction, his expression revealing an intense internal struggle. "Sophia," he said carefully, "he did the same thing with me when I was little. Sometimes. But then there was always something more important." Sophia considered this for a moment, then looked directly into Peter's eyes. "Do you want him to leave?" Because you're afraid he'll abandon me like he abandoned you. The question caught Peter off guard. He blinked several times, clearly not expecting such insight from a 6-year-old. Yes, partly, yes. Sophia nodded gravely, as if she understood something the adults had missed. So you're trying to protect me, she said, like a big brother protects his little sister. Peter felt tears burn his eyes. I'm not your brother, he mumbled. But you could be, Sophia said simply, if you wanted to. Mary Ann, who had been watching the exchange in silence, finally spoke. Peter, maybe Sophia is right. Maybe instead of fighting with each other, we should work together. You could help make sure your father doesn't make the same mistakes. Peter looked at his mother in surprise. Are you defending him now? I'm defending the possibility of healing, Mary Ann replied. For all of us, including you. Edward, who had remained silent for most of the conversation, finally found the courage to speak. Peter, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I broke your trust irreparably. But if you give me a chance, not for me, but for Sophia, I promise that this time will be different. Your promises are worthless, Peter replied, but his voice had lost some of its harshness. Sophia approached Peter and touched his arm. What if we both keep an eye on him, she suggested. That way he can't forget the promises he made. Peter looked at Sophia, then at Edward, then at Mary Ann. The room was charged with tension, expectation, and a hope as fragile as glass. I don't trust you, Peter said to Edward, but I care about her, and if you hurt her, I won't hurt her, Edward interrupted. I swear on my mother's memory, I won't. Peter studied his father's face for a long moment. Then prove it, he finally said. Prove that you've changed, because this time I'll be watching. The days following the confrontation with Peter were marked by a delicate dance of approach and caution. Peter had decided to stay in the States indefinitely, moving into the guest room of the apartment that had once been his home. His presence transformed the dynamic of the newly formed household, creating moments of tension interspersed with small miracles of connection. Sophia, with a child's natural wisdom for breaking down barriers, became an unwitting bridge between father and son. She constantly asked Peter to join in the activities she did with Edward, forcing interactions that might otherwise never have happened. Peter, she called out one sunny morning, Mr. Ed is going to teach me how to write my name today. Do you want to watch? Peter, who was making coffee in the kitchen, hesitated for a moment before nodding. Sure, Sophia, I'd love to watch. Edward, sitting at the dining room table with sheets of paper and colored pencils spread out before him, watched his son approach cautiously. Over the past few days, he had noticed how Peter observed his interactions with Sophia, always alert, always ready to intervene if he detected signs of past negligent behavior. Look, Peter, Sophia exclaimed, proudly showing off the shaky letters she had managed to form. I wrote S-O-P-H-I-A. That's beautiful, Peter said genuinely, sitting down next to her. When I was your age, my letters were much messier. Mr. Ed said you were very smart in school, Sophia commented innocently. He has a box full of your drawings and tests saved. Peter looked at Edward in surprise. You kept my schoolwork. Edward blushed slightly. I kept everything, every drawing, every test, every little note you wrote. He paused. They're all in the cabinet in my office. I would look at them when I missed you. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Peter looked away, clearly touched by the revelation. Sophia, sensing the emotional tension, had a sudden idea. We could make a book, she exclaimed, with Peter's drawings from when he was little and my drawings from now. Edward smiled, the first genuinely enthusiastic suggestion he'd made in weeks sprouting in his mind. That would be a wonderful idea. We could tell the story of our family through the drawings. Our family? Peter questioned, but his voice lacked the hardness of the previous days. If you want it to be, Edward said carefully, all of us, you, me, your mom, and Sophia. Peter looked at Sophia, who watched him with hope shining in her eyes. What do you think, Sophia? Do you want me to be part of your family? Of course, she replied without hesitation. Families are supposed to be together, and you're my big brother now. Mary Ann, who had been watching the conversation from the kitchen doorway, approached with tears in her eyes. Maybe we can start today, she suggested. We can look for Peter's old schoolwork, and Sophia can make new drawings to go with them. The afternoon was spent exploring dusty boxes filled with memories. Edward had truly saved everything, from Peter's first scribbles at age 3 to elaborate essays from his teenage years. Each unearthed item sparked conversations, explanations, and, surprisingly, laughter. Look at this! Mary Ann laughed, holding up a drawing Peter had made at 5. You drew our family as superheroes. Sophia studied the drawing with fascination. Who's this? She asked, pointing to a small figure next to the others. That's a dog, Peter explained. I always wanted a dog, but Dad said we were too busy to take care of one. Edward felt a familiar pang of guilt, but this time it was accompanied by determination. Maybe now is a good time to get a dog, he said. If Sophia wants one, of course. Sophia's eyes widened with joy. A real dog. For our family. For our family, Edward confirmed, looking directly at Peter. If we all agree... Peter studied his father's face for a long moment, searching for signs of the empty promise he feared he would find. But there was something different in Edward's eyes now, a sincerity Peter hadn't seen in years. Are you serious? He asked, completely serious. We can go to the animal shelter tomorrow, if you'd like. Sophia was practically vibrating with excitement, but it was Peter who said the words that changed everything. I'd like that, he admitted. I always wanted to do that with you when I was a kid. Edward felt tears burn his eyes. Me too, he confessed. And I'm so sorry I missed that chance back then. Maybe, Peter said carefully, it's not too late to make new chances. Mary Ann, watching the exchange between father and son, felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine hope. Not the desperate hope that things would go back to how they were, but the realistic hope that they could build something new and better. Sophia, unknowingly, had become the catalyst they needed to heal old wounds and build bridges over chasms that had seemed impassable. You know, Edward said softly, I think Sophia was right from the beginning. Sometimes people just need a second chance to show who they can really be. Peter nodded slowly. And sometimes, he replied, they need a brave little girl to teach them how to love again. In that moment, looking at Sophia surrounded by old and new drawings, they all knew they were on the right path to becoming a real family. The visit to the animal shelter the next morning began as a moment of pure joy for Sophia. Her eyes shone as she looked at dogs of all sizes and ages, each with its own story of abandonment and hope. Edward, Peter, and Mary Ann followed her, all touched by the girl's genuine happiness. This one, Sophia exclaimed, stopping in front of a small dog with a mixed golden coat. He reminds me of the little bear in the story. The dog, noticing the attention, approached the gate with its tail wagging shyly. There was a gentleness in its eyes that echoed Sophia's own nature. Her name is Honey, the shelter employee explained. She was found 3 months ago, very scared. It took weeks for her to trust people again. Sophia carefully extended her hand through the bars, and Honey sniffed it before gently licking her fingers. Just like me, Sophia murmured. She needed to learn how to trust again, too. Edward's heart ached at the comparison. As they filled out the adoption paperwork, Sophia played with Honey in a penned-in area outside, her crystal-clear laughter echoing across the yard. It was then that the employee asked a question that changed everything. Do you have Sophia's custody papers? She asked casually while checking the forms. Edward and Mary Ann exchanged a look. In the emotional rush of the past few days, the legal issue had taken a back seat. We're still arranging that, Edward said carefully, the employee's brow furrowed. I see. It's just that we received a call yesterday from Child Protective Services asking about a girl named Sophia who was reportedly in an irregular care situation. Edward's blood ran cold. Child Protective Services? Yes. It seems someone filed a report. They're coming here this afternoon to investigate the situation. Peter, who had been watching Sophia play, hurried over. A report. From who? Edward knew the answer before the employee even spoke. The report came from a concerned ex-wife, worried about the child's well-being. Mary Ann turned pale. But I would never do that. The employee consulted her notes. Actually, it was from a woman who identified herself as the first ex-wife. She said the man has a history of emotional instability and family abandonment. Edward felt the world spin. His first ex-wife could only be Carla, whom he had been briefly married to 10 years before meeting Mary Ann. A marriage that had ended for the exact same reasons: his work obsession and inability to commit emotionally. How did she even know about Sophia? Edward murmured. Peter clenched his fists. Oh, she probably saw the pictures I posted on Instagram about being back in the States, or someone told her. Sophia, sensing the adult's agitation, approached with Honey in her arms. What happened? Why do you all look so scared? Edward knelt beside her, trying to keep his voice calm. Sophia, some people are worried about whether we're taking good care of you. They want to talk to us to make sure you're safe and happy. But I am, Sophia protested. You're my family now? I know, Princess, and we're going to explain that to them. Mary Ann pulled Edward aside. Edward, if they take Sophia, her voice trembled. They won't, Edward said with a fierce determination that surprised even himself. I won't let them. Peter joined them. Dad, you have to be realistic. Without legal paperwork, without a formalized adoption process, they have the right to remove Sophia and put her in foster care. Edward looked at Sophia, who was hugging Honey as if she were a protective talisman. The thought of losing her after just discovering what it felt like to truly love a child was unbearable. Then we have to speed up the legal process, he said. Today. It's Saturday, Dad. The courthouses are closed. Edward ran his hands through his hair, desperate. Then he had an idea. Rob! He exclaimed. Robert Silverman. He's a lawyer who specializes in child advocacy, and he owes me a few favors. While Edward frantically made calls, trying to locate the lawyer, Sophia approached Peter. Peter, are they going to take me away? Peter knelt beside her, his voice gentle but honest. We don't know yet, Sophia, but I promise we're going to fight for you to stay with us. Even though you're still mad at Mr. Ed. Peter glanced at Edward, who was still speaking desperately on the phone, and then back at Sophia. You know, Sophia, I don't think I'm that mad anymore. Seeing how much he cares about you, how much we all care about you. Maybe he really has changed. Sophia smiled through the tears that were starting to form. So now you'll be friends again. Maybe more than friends, Peter said softly. Maybe we can be father and son again, for real this time. Edward, who had managed to speak with Robert and arrange an emergency meeting, returned to them. I got him. Rob will meet us at his office in an hour. He said he can fast-track some processes, but what? Mary Ann asked. But he can't guarantee anything if CPS decides Sophia is in an at-risk situation. Sophia squeezed Edward's hand tightly. I'm not at risk, she said with conviction. You protect me. You love me. Edward felt tears burn his eyes. Yes. Sophia, we love you, more than words can say. Then we fight, Peter said, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. Together, like a real family. As they headed for the car, leaving Honey temporarily at the shelter with the promise to return, none of them knew that the hardest battle of their lives was just beginning. Robert Silverman's law office was located in a sleek office building downtown. Even though it was a Saturday, the lawyer had answered Edward's desperate plea, understanding the urgency of the situation. Sophia held tightly to Edward's and Peter's hands as they rode the elevator, her large eyes reflecting a precocious understanding that something important was about to happen. Robert, a man in his 50s with graying hair and a reassuring presence, greeted them with a warm hug for Edward and a gentle smile for Sophia. "So this is the famous Sophia I've heard so much about," he said, crouching to be at the girl's level. "Edward told me you love stories." Sophia nodded shyly, still processing the gravity of the situation. "Rob," Edward began urgently, "I need to know what our options are. The social workers are investigating today, and I won't lose Sophia." Robert gestured for everyone to sit in his conference room. "Edward, I'll be straight with you. The situation is complicated. Sophia is in your care without formal legal authorization. Technically, that can be considered irregular custody." Marianne leaned forward. "But Edward didn't kidnap her. She was abandoned, alone on the streets." "I understand that," Robert replied patiently. "And that's our main defense. Edward acted out of humanitarian compassion. However, the correct protocol would have been to contact Child Protective Services immediately." Peter, who had been watching Sophia during the conversation, asked a question that surprised everyone. "Sophia, do you want to stay with us, even knowing it might be hard?" Sophia looked around the room, her gaze resting on each face she had come to love. "I want to stay with you forever," she said in a small but determined voice. "You're my real family now." Robert jotted down some notes. "Sophia's testimony will be crucial. If she clearly demonstrates that she is happy and safe in your care, it significantly strengthens our case." Just then, Robert's phone rang. The conversation was brief, but everyone could see his expression grow more serious. "They're on their way," he announced when he hung up. "The social workers and a prosecutor from the DA's office. They'll be here in 15 minutes. Edward felt panic rise in his chest. He looked at Sophia, who was innocently playing with a children's puzzle Robert kept in his office for situations like this. "Rob, if they take her today, we'll do everything in our power to prevent that," Robert reassured him. "But Edward, you need to be prepared for the possibility of a temporary separation while the legal process moves forward." "No," the word escaped Edward with a force that surprised even him. "I will not let that happen." Marianne touched his arm. "Edward, if it's what's best for Sophia, what's best for Sophia is to be with people who love her." Edward stood up, pacing to the window. "You saw what she was like on the streets, Marianne. You saw how she's blossomed with us. How can I hand her over to strangers again?" Peter watched his father's desperation and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pride. For the first time in his life, he saw Edward fighting for something more important than his own comfort. "Dad," he said softly, maybe there's a way." All eyes turned to Peter. "I have a proposal," he continued. "What if I formally co-adopt Sophia? I'm 25. I have a stable job offer in Germany I can defer, and I can prove financial stability. With the two of you officially reconciling, we could present a much stronger case." Edward looked at his son with growing admiration. "You would do that?" "After everything, I'd do it for her," Peter replied, looking at Sophia. "And maybe for us, too." Robert's face lit up. "That's an excellent strategy. A joint adoption with a solid family history that would completely change our position." At that moment, Robert's secretary buzzed through the intercom to announce that the authorities had arrived. Sophia, sensing the renewed tension in the room, approached Edward. "Mr. Ed, are you scared?" Edward knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his. "I am. But do you know why? Because you've become the most important thing in my life. And when we love someone that much, We sometimes get scared of losing them. But real love doesn't go away, Sophia said with the wisdom that constantly surprised them. Even if people are far apart for a little while, the love is still here. She touched her chest. Peter came over and knelt on Sophia's other side. She's right, Dad, and no matter what happens today, the love we've built won't disappear. Mary Ann joined the family circle. Sophia, honey, some people are going to ask you questions today. You just need to tell the truth about how you feel with us, okay? Sophia nodded bravely. I'll tell them you make me feel safe and loved, because it's true. Robert opened his office door. Are you ready? He asked. Edward took a deep breath, looking at his newly formed family, Peter, with whom he had finally made peace, Mary Ann, who had given him a second chance, and Sophia, who had taught him how to love unconditionally. We're ready, he said with conviction. The door opened and 3 people entered, 2 social workers and a prosecutor. Sophia's future would be decided in the next few minutes. The final battle was about to begin. The tension in the room was palpable as the 3 officials settled around the conference table. Dr. Carmen Hayes, a senior social worker, led the group with a professional but not unsympathetic demeanor. Beside her, Mr. Mark Andrews, a prosecutor specializing in child welfare, closely observed each member of the gathered family. The third person, Dr. Anna Marie Beatty, a child psychologist, offered a gentle smile to Sophia. Good afternoon, Dr. Hayes began. We are here to assess the situation of the minor, Sophia, and to ensure her rights and well-being are being protected. Sophia, seated between Edward and Peter, held both their hands with a confidence that impressed everyone present. Sophia, Dr. Beatty said softly, could you tell us what it's been like living with Mr. Myers and his family? Sophia looked around the room, her eyes shining with sincerity. They make me feel special, she began in her clear voice. Mr. Ed reads me stories every day and taught me that I'm smart. Mary Ann makes me yummy food and helps me braid my hair. And Peter is like the big brother I always wanted. Mr. Andrews leaned forward. Sophia, do you remember what your life was like before you met Mr. Myers? Sophia nodded gravely. I slept on the street and sometimes I was hungry. I was scared at night and I cried because I had nobody to take care of me. Her voice grew stronger. But I'm not scared anymore. Now I know I'm loved. Dr. Hayes consulted her file. Mr. Myers, do you understand that taking custody of a child without following proper legal procedures is a serious violation? Edward took a deep breath. I understand completely, Dr. Hayes, and I take full responsibility for my decision. But when I saw Sophia alone, abandoned, I couldn't just hand her over to the system and walk away. It may have been impulsive, but it was driven by love. Do you have prior experience with children? Mr. Andrews asked. Peter, surprisingly, answered before Edward. He's my father, he said simply. And while our relationship has had its problems in the past, I can testify to the genuine transformation I've seen in him since Sophia came into our lives. Dr. Beatty made a note. Peter, could you elaborate on that transformation? My father has always been a brilliant man, but emotionally distant. He prioritized work above all else. But Sophia, she has awakened in him a capacity for unconditional love that I had never seen. He has cancelled important meetings to be with her, set aside projects to teach her to read. For the first time in my life, I have seen my father genuinely put someone else first. Mary Ann added, Doctors, Edward and I are reconciling. Part of that reconciliation is due to the way Sophia has brought us together as a family. We are prepared to offer her a stable, loving, and complete home. Dr. Hayes observed the family dynamic for a few minutes. Mr. Myers, what is your long-term plan for Sophia? Education, medical care, emotional development? Edward had prepared for this question. I've already enrolled Sophia in an excellent private school that starts next semester. I have a trusted pediatrician who has already examined her and confirmed she is healthy. Financially, I can provide everything she needs. He paused. But more importantly, I can give her what she needs most, a family that loves her unconditionally. Robert intervened professionally. Doctors, my client is prepared to immediately begin the formal adoption process. We also have Peter's proposal to co-adopt Sophia, creating an even more solid support network. Mr. Andrews studied Peter. Young man, are you aware of the responsibilities that co-adoption entails? I am, Peter answered without hesitation. Sophia has taught me that family isn't just about blood, but about choice and commitment. I choose to be her brother. I choose to protect her. I choose to be present in a way my father couldn't be for me when I was a child. Dr. Beatty asked one more question, directly to Sophia. Sophia, if you could have 3 wishes, what would they be? Sophia thought carefully. First, I want to stay with my family forever. Second, I want to learn to read all the books in the world. And third, I want all the children who are lonely like I was to find a family that loves them. 2. The silence that followed was profound. Even Mr. Andrews, known for his professional rigor, seemed touched by the girl's words. Dr. Hayes exchanged a look with her colleagues before speaking. It is evident that Sophia is thriving in the care of this family. Although procedures were not initially followed, the child's well-being is our primary priority. Edward held his breath. Our recommendation, Dr. Hayes continued, is that Sophia remain in the temporary custody of the Myers family while the formal adoption process proceeds. There will be monthly follow-up visits for 6 months, and a final report will determine the permanent adoption. Sophia jumped from her chair and hugged Edward tightly. Does that mean I can stay? She asked, tears of joy shining in her eyes. It means you're home, Edward replied, his voice thick with emotion. Peter stood up and hugged them both. Followed by Mary Ann. Robert smiled, proud of the outcome. Mr. Andrews added, the family will be required to commit to regular family therapy to ensure a healthy adjustment to the new dynamic for everyone. We commit to whatever is necessary, Edward said. Dr. Beatty approached Sophia. Sophia, you are a very brave and special little girl. I'm sure you will be very happy with your family. As the officials prepared to leave, Dr. Hayes made one final comment. In 20 years of my career, I have rarely seen such a genuine family transformation. Sophia, you were lucky to find this family. And you, she looked at Edward, Peter, and Mary Ann, were lucky to find her. After everyone had left, the family remained in a long embrace. Sophia finally had the family she had always dreamed of. Edward had rediscovered his ability to love unconditionally. Peter had reconciled with his father, and Mary Ann had realized her dream of being a mother. Love had overcome all adversity. 6 months later, on a golden spring afternoon, Edward found himself on the steps of the public library again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Sophia, now with shiny hair in 2 braids done by Mary Ann, clutched a new book to her chest, her first book, written and illustrated by her, with the help of the whole family. Daddy Ed, she said, using the title she had started using after the adoption was officially finalized the week before. Can I read to the other kids now? Edward smiled, watching a small group of neighborhood children approach. Sophia had insisted on creating a story time at the library every Saturday, wanting to share the magic she had discovered in books with other kids. Of course, Princess, they're eager to hear your story. Peter walked up through the square, followed by Mary Ann and Honey, who had become the most spoiled dog in the family. Peter had decided to stay in the States for good, taking a job at a local company and renting an apartment near the family home. How was Sophia's first week of school? Peter asked, sitting next to his father on the steps. Incredible, Edward replied, watching Sophia arrange the children in a circle. Her teacher said she's the most dedicated student she's ever had, and that she has a natural talent for storytelling. Mary Ann joined them, settling Honey by her side. She wants to be a writer when she grows up, she said with maternal pride. Just like her dad. Edward looked at the woman he had won back and the son with whom he had finally made peace. In 6 months, his life had completely transformed. He had published a new book, the true story of how Sophia changed their lives, and all profits were being donated to shelters for abandoned children. Once upon a time, Sophia began in her clear voice, there was a little girl who lived all alone and was very scared. But one day, she found a magical family who taught her that love is the most powerful thing in the world. The children listened intently, mesmerized by the passion with which Sophia told her own story, and transformed into a fairy tale. The girl learned that it doesn't matter where you come from or how many fears you have. What matters is finding people who see what's special in you and who never give up on loving you. Edward felt tears of joy burn his eyes. 6 months ago, he had been a lost man, consumed by guilt and isolation. Now he was the father of an extraordinary girl, had reconciled with Peter, rebuilt his marriage with Mary Ann, and rediscovered his passion for writing. And so, Sophia continued, the girl, the daddy, the mommy, and the big brother lived happily ever after because they learned that family isn't about being perfect. It's about loving even when it's hard, forgiving even when it hurts, and never, ever giving up on each other. When Sophia finished the story, the children applauded enthusiastically. A little girl raised her hand. Sophia, is that story real? Sophia looked at Edward, Peter, and Mary Ann, her smile lighting up the entire square. Yes, she answered with absolute conviction. It's the most real story there is, and you know what's most magical, it's still being written every single day. Edward stood up and approached Sophia, extending his hand. How about we head home? Your mum made that chocolate cake you love. And I brought a new game to teach Honey, Peter added. Sophia said goodbye to the children, promising to return next week with a new story. As they walked across the square toward home, she held Edward's and Peter's hands, swinging happily between them. Daddy Ed, she said, do you remember what you asked me on the first day, about what I wanted most in the world? I remember, Edward replied. You said you wanted a real family. And you? Do you remember what you said when I asked you the same thing? Edward smiled, recalling the conversation in that hotel, which seemed like it had happened in another lifetime. I said I wanted the exact same thing. Sophia stopped walking and looked around, at Edward, Peter, Mary Ann, and even Honey, who was trotting happily beside them. Then our wishes came true, she said simply. And now we can wish for new things. What do you wish for now? Mary Ann asked. Sophia thought for a moment, then smiled with that wisdom that constantly surprised them. I wish for our family to keep growing, not just in size, but in love, and that we can help other children find their families too. Edward stopped and knelt in front of Sophia, taking her small hands in his. You know, Sophia, when I found you that afternoon, I thought I was helping you. But really, you're the one who saved me. You taught me that it's never too late to learn how to truly love. And you taught me that families can be built with love, not just blood, Sophia replied. Peter came over and placed his hands on both their shoulders. And you too taught me that forgiveness is possible, and that sometimes the most important things in life arrive when you least expect them. Mary Ann joined the family hug. And all of you taught me that dreams can come true, even when you think you've lost every chance. As they walked home, the sun began to set, painting the sky with golden hues that perfectly framed the family fate had so unexpectedly brought together. Edward looked back one last time, seeing the library where it all began, and smiled. Sometimes, he thought, the most casual encounters can change lives forever. A forgotten book in a donation box had become the bridge between a lost man and an abandoned child, proving that the best stories are the ones we live, not just the ones we write. And this story, Edward knew, was only just beginning.